Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Chuck Tucker, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, the fourth in a series called Prioritizing Undergraduate Education. The idea for this series came from the Campus Conversation on Undergraduate Education, a project that began in fall 2013 with more than 600 participants, faculty, staff, and students expressing their aspirations for what an Illinois education can and should be. Many projects have sprung from that first conversation, and in fact, apparently we're shamelessly hawking the project website here in front of you, undergrad-education.illinois.edu. You can go there and see all the cool things that have sprung from that and continue to. And you can also find on the yellow box the previous lectures in the series. It was clear from that conversation that the campus needed a venue to continue to talk about larger issues about undergraduate education. What it means to be an educated person at this particular moment in history, how we should respond to that educational need in a comprehensive land-grant public research university, how we articulate our sense of purpose and direction with our many external stakeholders. Hence this lecture series. We're indebted to Professors Claire Croston, Department of History, and Chris Higgins, Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership, co-chairs of the lecture series committee, and to all their colleagues on the committee. Last fall, we heard from economics professor Nancy Fulbray, former president of Yale, Rick Levin, and Carolyn Dever, provost at Dartmouth. In addition to today's lecture, the organizers are planning a summary and discussion event for the afternoon of May 5. That's reading day if you're marking your calendar, and I hope you'll continue to participate. This afternoon, I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Harry Boyte. If we believe that a major purpose of higher education is to prepare people to be engaged and discerning citizens, few people are more qualified to speak to that purpose than Dr. Boyte. Harry is co-director of the Sabo Center for Democracy Citizenship at Augsburg College, an organization he helped found at the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs nearly 2 decades ago. He's also a senior fellow and graduate faculty member at the Humphrey Institute. Dr. Boyte is an architect of the Center for Democracy and Citizenship's public work approach to civic engagement and democracy. I underlined public work, those are key words for his talk today. This conceptual framework for citizenship has gained worldwide recognition both for its theoretical innovation and its practical effectiveness. From 1993 to 1995, Boyte served as national coordinator of the New Citizenship, a nonpartisan effort to bridge the citizen government gap. Presented New Citizenship findings to President Clinton, Vice President Gore, and other administration leaders at a 1995 Camp David seminar on the future of democracy, a presentation that helped shape Clinton's New Covenant State of the Union address that year. He's also served as a senior advisor to the National Commission on Civic Renewal and as a national associate of the Kettering Foundation. He's worked with organizations of all types that are concerned with community development, citizenship education, and civic renewal. For several months each year, Dr. Boyte resides in South Africa, where he's working with colleagues to analyze models of citizen democracy across Africa. In the 1960s, he worked with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a field secretary with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Harry Boyte is the author of 9 books on citizenship, democracy, and community organizing, and his writings have appeared in publications that include the New York Times, Perspectives on Politics, Kettering Review, and the Wall Street Journal. He earned a doctorate degree in political and social thought from the Union Institute. Today, he will speak to us about public universities and the future of democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harry Boyte.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you. Okay, this is my sound. So if my sound wavers, let me know, okay? Good afternoon. Sometimes when someone says, I worked with Martin Luther King. Students saying, "You're still alive." It's a pleasure to be here at a great public and land-grant university talking about this odd topic of what is the relationship between public universities and democracy. I want to thank Chris and Claire and the Committee on Undergraduate Education, the Campus Conversations on Undergraduate Education. I think this is a crucial topic. As you all know, higher education is in the midst of a lot of changes. Student debt, anybody know about that? Technological transformation, rising costs, declining support, and political attacks. And in this context, educators and students often feel powerless, more spectators than agents of their own lives. So this conversation about undergraduate education is an important step towards regaining power and agency. And it addresses the largest challenge of our time. What is democracy? What are we going to do about the fact that our imaginations about democracy have dramatically shrunk? Every single candidate in this year's election on Republican and Democratic side defines elections as the meaning of democracy. I learned in the freedom movement that is just a tiny sliver of democracy. Democracy in the great tradition of the freedom movement and the settlements and the land-grant tradition meant democracy as a way of life which is empowering, built in every setting. A way of life. In families, in churches, in schools, in community organizations, and businesses, in colleges and universities, and government agencies. So keep that in mind. But let me start with a story from South Africa, which shows both the possibilities and the challenges. So in 2002, I went to South Africa for the first time, seeking to woo my wife, who was South African. She said she came to the University of Minnesota in 2001 as Humphrey International Fellow. I had met her once before. She worked for a very important democracy organization in South Africa and across Africa called IDASA, the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. So she wanted to work with our center. I said I would be delighted and took her around America. But she said she wouldn't marry me unless I came to South Africa. So I thought I'd better come. And a professor in the School of Planning, Mzed Mayakiso, who knew my work in democracy and community organizing and the movement, asked me to speak to his class. There were about 30 students there, all black, mostly from townships like Soweto and Alexandra outside of Johannesburg. And I talked to them about the tradition, which I want to discuss today, of what we call citizen professional. Now, citizen professional is something I saw in the movement as a college student. The movement's foundations were citizen professionals, beauticians, business owners, teachers, college professors, undertakers, people in all walks of life, who saw their work not simply in terms of their particular field, but also in terms of the movement, fighting segregation in the South. This was the movement against segregation, but also equally deepening the meaning of democracy. So there were three themes that I want to lift up, and I talked to the students about it, Wits. First of all, a citizen professional is someone who is patriotic, not in the sense of belligerent nationalism, which we hear a lot about today, but in the sense of someone who loves America and its democratic possibilities. So the workbook of the Citizenship Education Program, which I worked with, which educated people all across the South to go back and create what we called citizenship schools, where people learned some organizing skills, community organizing skills, and learned nonviolence. The workbook said, "We love America, it's our land." It also expressed deep connection with peoples around the world struggling for freedom, the new colonies in Africa and Latin America and Asia. It said that anyone in the Western Hemisphere has a right and we invite to call themselves American. So it wasn't a bellicose nationalist version, America first, it was a deep sense of patriotism. So the first thing was a deep sense of patriotism. Second thing was an understanding of citizens of such a democratic society as not in terms of legal status or rights. After all, in the movement, we were fighting against the terrible denial of first-class citizenship rights to African Americans. Citizen was a co-creator and an agent of change in a democratic society. Co-creator. Someone who builds a society and builds communities. So it was also built on the idea that democracy is a work in progress, never finished. It's refreshed by every generation and every wave of immigrants. So immigrants are not to be feared. They're welcomed as tremendous resources for refreshment of the democratic possibility. And thirdly, as I said before, the meaning of democracy was a democratic way of life, and it rested on citizens who were powerful agents of their own lives and of communities. So the idea of agency and power and capacity and boldness was central, and I saw that enacted all the time in the Citizenship Education Program. The director, Dorothy Cotton, would listen to people coming from across the South for a week to go back to communities and build citizenship classes, usually in church basements. These weren't formal schools. These were informal in church basements and in community halls and businesses. And she would hear terrible stories of oppression. And it was almost always the third day, she would say, "You've got to get over it. If you feel like a victim, if you define yourself as oppressed, you are never going to be a first-class citizen." And she would have everyone sing a song. I might have us sing a song today. "We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody else is going to rescue us. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are the ones who are going to make change. We've been waiting for." It was used in the Obama campaign in 2008. So it expressed the idea of people as the agents and foundations of democracy. There's no rescuer, there's no politician, there's no expert who can come in and save us. That was the very foundation of the movement, and it was an understanding of democracy. So you know what happened when I told this story? The story at the university, the students at the University of Witwatersrand were really furious. They said, "We haven't heard a word about this. This is why we came to get a university education. We didn't come because we wanted to be rich. We didn't come because we wanted to move to the suburbs. We wanted to go back to Soweto and Alexandria and our communities and work in an empowering way with the communities we came from. And we want to build the society." They were patriotic. So story after story of their anger that they weren't learning how to be citizen professionals. It was a term that really resonated. So the possibility is the eagerness for young people to make a difference in their communities and in the society. The downside is they hadn't heard anything about it. So let me tell you what I'm going to talk about today. I want to suggest that higher education, universities, like Illinois need to recover a very rich history of citizen professionalism and democratic patriotism. And it's different than the way the debate usually goes. So the debate is often posed, as in President Levin's speech in November, which had many interesting points about curriculum change. But the debate is posed as education for global citizenship, and it's counterposed to narrow nationalism. I want to suggest a third concept, what we call democratic internationalism, what I learned in the movement, which is love of country and its democratic possibilities in the context of deep respect for other peoples around the world. They're not counterposed. And secondly, I'm going to argue that rich in the history of Illinois and other land grants and public universities is a concept of citizen professional, which is different than the current debate, which poses the liberal arts on the one hand and then preparation for careers and vocations on the other. There's a polarity. They're seen as opposites. They're seen as in tension. Citizen professional is about preparing students who are not going to simply fit into the world as it is. They recognize and begin with the world as it is. They learn how to read savvy politically the world as it is, but they learn how to be agents of change and the reconstruction of businesses, schools, clinics, government, IT operations, every setting. So rather than saying we need to train students for today's jobs, which is a conformist definition of education, the challenge is to prepare students who are agents of the kind of creative change we need as a society. And that, again, is rich in the history of land grants. And it means, finally, getting beyond the notion that education is mainly about the mind. It is about the mind. It's about the intellect. But it's about the head. But it's equally about the heart, cultivating affections and capacities for relationships and human connections. And thirdly, it's about the hand. It's about work in the world. It's about the skills and capacities of making a difference in the world, or as Julie Ellison puts it, jobs that pay and matter. So at the root of this understanding of the land grant tradition and its future and its relationship to democracy, I want to argue we need education for head, but also heart and hand. So let me begin with a discussion of the tradition of public universities and land grants, like the University of Illinois. To recall the democratic purposes of higher education and public universities is to go back more than 100 years to a movement among students and faculty and young intellectuals called Back to the People movement. Jane Addams, Elaine Locke, a great philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance, who had a lot of influence in the civil rights movement. People like John Dewey, a whole generation of intellectuals basically were part of people's movements for change. As a historian, Louis Fuhr put it, they were part of the Back to the People movement. The Depression of the 80s, the waves of immigrants, poverty shook America out of its complacency. Jane Addams, is a leading voice of young people, said we were all motivated by a desire to get back to the people, to be identified with the common lot, each of us magnified by a sense of largeness as we were involved in the great project of American democracy. Lloyd said, I am on the side of the underdog. The agitators on that side make mistakes, no doubt, but for all of that, theirs is the right side. Universities like the University of Michigan in those years were pioneers in rethinking the meaning of higher education, making democracy a central question. So at Michigan, where John Dewey came, and James Angell, the president from 1871 to 1909, believed that public universities need to both embody and also to help shape the dynamics of a changing democracy. He built on the pioneering admission of women in Michigan in 1870 to create a democratic atmosphere. We need to remember that today on campuses, full of debate and discussion and disagreement that is both lively and surfaces tensions and differences, but also constructive, not acrimonious and nasty and accusatory. The seminar as a teaching method was increasingly used. Science students were able to take a wider selection of courses. John Dewey arrived, the educational philosopher, arrived at Michigan in 1884. And let me give some background on John Dewey, because he's an important figure here. He was a pioneering philosopher in education and also in what was called pragmatism, a philosophical American school, that tested ideas by their effects in the world. He said he learned most of who he was and what he believed from people, not from books. So he came with an appreciation for real-life experience. He also believed that knowledge was a social product. It wasn't created simply in academia and then handed out to the world. There was an interplay of knowledge. He gave a great story of imagine the compass. The compass was an invention of human design that was a product of millennia of experimentation, people passing on insights and knowledge and handing on contributions from one generation to the next, and thousands of people who were anonymous, who were invisible, developing something like a compass. He said that was true for every kind of knowledge. It is profoundly wrong to think about knowledge as the product of isolated, detached academics. In fact, he compared detached academics with evangelists who he didn't really like too much because his mother was an evangelical figure who kind of fussed at him all his life. But he said, evangelists, for all of their problems, are more in tune with humanity than many academics who are detached and in the ivory tower. Because at least they're involved with the life of people and the problems and the needs and the sufferings of everyday citizens. It's too easy in the ivory tower academic world to become detached and see yourself outside. He also was astute. He said this is also a power pattern. So if you profess to be this expert who knows all the answers, you gain a kind of authority that makes you on top, not on tap. He argued that truth needs to be the point of knowledge production, but it needs to be social and it needs to spread across the Commonwealth. And finally, John Dewey had a deep respect for everyday citizens' intelligence. The insight, the imagination of everyday citizens who don't necessarily have formal degrees at all, but he said can be sources of wisdom and insight and inspiration and knowledge and surprise that people in an ivory tower culture by themselves can never produce. So all these things were part of the mix of the generation of the Back to the People, and it was also part of the understanding of science that Andrew Jewett in his recent book, Science, Democracy, and the American University from the Civil War to the Cold War, shows how in the first half of the 20th century, most scientists and engineers saw themselves as about democracy, building a larger society. They weren't simply doing their thing, they were actually contributing to a larger concept, democratic society. So this is a very significant portion of the land-grant and public university tradition. And it was built around the idea of empowering people to be agents of their own lives. So Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was dean of the College of Agriculture at a land-grant school, Cornell University, argued that every aspect of higher education needed to be infused with a spirit of public work. Bailey was a leading scientist, one of the world's leading horticulturalists. He developed many specialties at Cornell. But he argued that every student graduating from Cornell should see their work as part of a great public work and shouldn't simply deliver their specialty, but should work with communities always with an eye to communities' own capacities for self-empowerment, for self-motivation, for development of their capacities to act together cooperatively. This was a very widespread theme in public universities like Illinois. So Mary Mims of Louisiana State, founder of what was called the Community Organization Movement in land grants, worked with, the movement worked with more than 1,000 communities, low-income communities, and African American and European American communities across the South especially, believed that the point of community organization should be to help awaken the powers of communities themselves. So extension workers going out, agricultural workers, home economics workers, 4-H workers, should be 11. And she said that a major mistake is the idea that you can impose your ideas from the outside on communities. You have to find the democratic talents and capacities within communities. And within any community, of any background, if you get to know the community, you can find things to build on which are democratic, which are full of possibilities. Now, Mims, interestingly, was also a good example of democratic internationalism. So I want to lift up another little-known tradition that is central to the educational philosophy of the 21st century. She went to Denmark to study what's called the Scandinavian folk school tradition. Now, that's important in my experience because the citizenship education program of the freedom movement that I talked about was inspired by the Harlem Renaissance and by the settlement house tradition and by Danish folk schools. So it had a very strong influence. So I'm very interested that there was this connection between the folk school tradition and the land-grant tradition and public universities. But the folk school tradition, founded by Nikolai Grundtvig, a Danish philosopher and theologian, put this as the aim of education. Education should be for life, not for death. He didn't like Danish education, which he said was detached from the real lives and experiences of everyday citizens, the common people. And the curriculum in Denmark at those years, this was the early 19th century, was in Latin, a language that nobody spoke, Latin. So when he said we're educating students for death, he meant a dead language. It was abstract, it was detached from people's everyday lives and experiences. So education for life is education in which students and faculty interact in constant conversation, that he was proposed that they live together, that you have a dynamic sense of learning community, that faculty learn from students as well as students from learning from faculty. Everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to contribute. That education should pull in and draw on the life experience and cultures of all the students. So it shouldn't be one way, filling up students. In fact, our center is now at Augsburg, and it came out of the folk school movement in Norway, which was an offshoot of the Danish folk school movement. The Sverdrup, the second president, said, education should never be like pouring peas into an empty sack. It should not be faculty who are eloquent and students who are dumbstruck. It should not be teaching students to conform to the world, but to be change agents in the world. So that was the spirit of the folk schools. And Mary Mims brought this to public universities like Illinois and LSU, all across the University of Minnesota. So and Tuskegee and the HBCUs in the South that were also land grants. So there was a very rich, thick tradition of the idea of education for life connected to community organizing in which communities develop power and spirit. And I'm not going to romanticize, there were a lot of problems. So the University of Minnesota was integrated in the 30s, but also dorms were segregated. It did have a positive upside, that the African-American students at the University of Minnesota lived in the settlement house, Phyllis Wheatley, the black settlement on the north side of Minneapolis, and they interacted with all the kids in the neighborhood. So they saw themselves as giving kids inspiration and educational aspiration and so forth. But there were a lot of flaws in the land-grant system, and there were expert trends that saw to themselves as having all the answers. So the president of the University of Minnesota, Lotus Kaufman, in the 1920s and the 1930s, when he came in his inaugural speech, said that there are some in the University of Minnesota who want us to climb up on a Mount Olympus, far from the people, but as long as I'm here, that's never going to happen. We need to be among the people. We need to be part of the society. In fact, Kaufman had a great phrase. He said, the university is neither the property nor the product of a small group of people at the University of Minnesota. It expresses the spirit and the energy and the life of the whole society, the whole state. So that's a great tradition you have to build on. It's a narrative tradition to recover. So what happened? What happened? Well, we've increasingly seen the development of a culture of detachment in higher education and a one-way notion of expert knowledge production, where you're enlightening the people who are seen as ignorant and in need of fixing. And I want to give a little bit on that before I go into what we can do to revive the great tradition of democracy in higher education. So in 1997, the Kellogg Foundation asked our Center for Democracy and Citizenship to make an assessment of whether this land-grant tradition of working with communities, believing in a democratic purpose, empowering communities, whether that could be revived. And we didn't want to do an academic study. That's not the way we do research. We wanted to listen and get stories and examples. So the chair of the political science department, Ed Fogelman, who'd been at the U for 30 years, and I divided up senior faculty across the university. Remember this, Malaka? Her mother was involved in all this. And we interviewed about 45 senior faculty across colleges, people who'd been there a long time, who were seen as the success stories of the University of Minnesota. You know what we found? A lot of hidden unhappiness. Because what they described was a culture of growing detachment, where the norms of research were to be objective and outside the world, analyzing the world, criticizing the world, not part of the world. And that was true across fields and disciplines. And it was fed by different things. So I would say the changing norms of research changed the definition of science from a resource for democracy, cultural practices like cooperative inquiry and experimentation, to the notion of value-free technique. That didn't used to be the idea of science. It used to be seen as about democracy, not about detachment. The incentive structures changed, and the rankings came in. A study of the disciplines by leaders in 4 fields: English, political science, economics, and philosophy, edited by Carl Shorsky and Tom Bender, called American Academic Cultures and Transformation, charts by leaders in those 4 disciplines the growing insularity of the field, so the growing detachment from the life of the society, the self-referentiality. It's a very important study to use and to look at. The norms were also impacted by a hyper-competitive society that was increasingly focused on defining success in terms of making money and individual success. And the idea of what the Harvard professor Lonnie Guinier, first African-American law professor at Harvard, calls the testocracy. The testocracy. That means measuring excellence by individual achievement, usually on tests. Now, what kind of crazy definition of excellence is that for a decent society? It's narrow. It takes out the heart and the hand, the relationships, the capacity for empathy and for doing creative work in the world and the skills that are needed for productive making change. So there were a lot of things at work, and it was embodied in a very famous speech by Donna Shalala when she was Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin in 1989. She gave a speech called the Dodds-Henry Lecture at the University of Illinois in the Chicago campus. She called for re-engagement with the world. So she was arguing that we needed to be re-engaged. We need to get beyond the detachment. But she gave a particular twist to that. So she said, what does this mean? It means the technocratic elite. People know what technocratic, it means ruled by experts. Technocratic elite of the best and brightest in service to the neediest, fixing America's problems like doctors once cured rickets. So see how that shifted, the understanding of the land-grant mission? From collaboration and empowerment to fixing and informing. So in that picture, citizens are seen as ignorant and passive and recipients. So there's a big shift. It's like a cultural identity shift. And that's a culture we have to get beyond. Now, there are resources, and one thing we could talk about a bit in the discussion is the task force we created with the provost from 2000 to 2002, looking at how to revive the land-grant mission of the University of Minnesota in the older democratic sense. And we used what we call a public work framework, which is the idea that citizen engagement is not simply or even most powerfully expressed as a volunteer or as a voter. So it's getting beyond the way we think about citizenship today. Citizenship is most powerfully expressed through your work. Through work with public meanings and significance. This, by the way, was a central theme in the folk school tradition. So Grundtvig believed that there should be an interaction across all professions, that young people should think about and compare and contrast different vocations and occupations and talk about how they all had possibilities to contribute to a good society. And that was part of the land-grant tradition, too, that Mary Mims brought to the... But it was also, in curricular terms, expressed in the idea that liberal arts need to always be connected to practical arts, a connection of mind with heart and hand. So we did a task force around that, built around the concepts of how to strengthen the public dimensions, the democratic dimensions of research and teaching and engagement with communities. And we learned a lot, and we made some mistakes, and we had a lot of conversation, and we broke a silence because a lot of faculty that I did interviews with said, I mean, these are the faculty stars at the university. It was amazing. They would say, you know, we've lost our public engagement. We've seen a kind of privatization of our cultures. And then they would say at the end of the conversations, I could never talk to my colleagues about this. So there was a silence, a really poignant silence. So we broke a silence, or we started to break a silence. And I would say that some successes came out of that. We also found, this is important, that especially for the research universities like Minnesota or Michigan or Illinois, you can't change one institution by itself. We've got huge forces to contend with, like the U.S. News and World Report rankings, which create incentives for universities to become detached from the life of communities in the society and to be exclusive, to feed into this testocracy that Lonnie Grenier talks about. Idea that excellence is only individual rather than cooperative. So we have challenges. We saw possibilities. We created some changes. We came up against the the rankings of U.S. News and World Report. Other institutions have too. I would say Syracuse University is recently a dramatic story of that. But I want to conclude with 3 ideas that seem to me central to making change. Citizen professional, the idea of rethinking assessment to focus on heart and hand, not only head. And thirdly, a great retrieval process and a projective process of what we call public narrative, stories. Every one of your stories, as well as our stories. And the stories of now. Why is this relevant now? So I want to talk about public narrative. A concept that came out of the Obama campaign, by the way, is kind of the secret weapon of the Obama campaign in 2008. We did thousands of trainings around public narrative. So citizen professionals. What does this mean? Well, it means preparing students, and also for faculty, so you can't really talk about students by themselves. Faculty need to learn these skills too, to be agents of change. So if you don't like something in a community, as the Wits students in South Africa understood, you need to learn how to make change. We have a youth initiative which has turned out to be very useful in the citizen professional work called Public Achievement. I started it in 1990 because I wanted young people in our time to have the same experiences of power and agency and hope and transformation that I had seen among kids younger than I was in the freedom movement. And so we started off with 21 discussions with teenagers across Minneapolis and St. Paul from all different backgrounds. We went to the jail, we went to halfway houses, we went to honors classes, to dance classes, to a hearing impaired class. And we asked, first of all, are there problems that concern you, that you're upset about, that you're mad about, that you're concerned about? Every single group, 21. Every single group had a long list. There was not one group that said, no, we're happy, we're just going to the mall. So that blew apart the conventional wisdom about young people, which is that they're apathetic and don't care. And then the second question was, is there anything you can do about these issues? And what do you think they said, teenagers said? No. We've never had a class on that. We don't know how to take action on problems we're worried about. And it varied, inner city St. Paul, it was like drive-bys and gangs, and suburbs, it was like drugs and homogeneity. I mean, there were different issues, but they all had issues. And generally, young people said, we don't know how to take action. We've never learned how to do that. But the third thing was really telling. You know what every single group said? Nobody has ever asked us that question. So what does that say? It says that young people that we were talking to had grown up in an environment where the expectations of what young people could do were very, very low. There was no imagination that young people could be agents of change and could be creative and could learn how to make change. So public achievement was built around some of the skills I knew from the citizenship schools of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then informed by community organizing skills. I'd been very interested and written a lot about community organizing. And then we found out something very important that I want to build into this discussion of what is a citizen professional, because we see it a lot. So the first year, we signed up students from my class and from friends' classes at the U so the way public achievement is set up, kids choose an issue they want to work on, they work as a team, and then coaches, older adults, but usually college students coach them. That's how it works. So we found a high school to try it out as a partner. I signed up coaches from the U. Coaches went to work with the high school students, and they all decided on one issue. They couldn't wear hats, and they were really mad about that. So they did a strike. They walked out. And the principal called a press conference and said, well, as far as I'm concerned, they can strike forever. I'm not going to allow hats. And does anybody know why she was able to say that and win the battle right away? Because they were gang colors. She said, I'm not going to allow gangs to advertise in my school. So the strike collapsed. And I went over and talked to the student leaders of the strike, and I said, so what did you learn? It was protest. They knew protest. That's what they had seen. You know what they said? They said, we learned you can't make any change. It's really hopeless. It's worse than we thought. So we knew that was not the message of public achievement. We did not want the students to come away more discouraged than they started out. We wanted students to learn how to make change. So we began to integrate in a school called St. Bernard's, working class, low-income school in St. Paul, Catholic school, methods of students learning their environment. So with students, when we talk about citizen professional, we use the concept that to make change, the first principle is you need to learn where you are. A great community organizer who was the tradition that schooled Barack Obama, Saul Alinsky, had a chapter in his first book called Community Traditions. If you go into a community, you get to know that community. You don't come in and say what you think is wrong with them. You get to know them. So it was the idea of learning where you are, and we develop ways for students to do that. And then also learning who has power, what kinds of issues in politics there are, what we call an everyday citizen politics. And the next year at St. Bernard's, we had some really dramatic examples of how that could work. Like a group of 12-year-old girls who were mad about sexual harassment. Team, 7 girls. They wanted to work on it. It was my student who was their coach, Melissa Bass, brought public achievement to Ole Miss now. But a couple of teachers, this was a pretty conservative Catholic school, said sexual issues are not too good for a Catholic school. So it would have been easy for them to say, it just shows it's terrible. But actually, we worked with Melissa, she worked with the girls, and what they did was called one-on-one interviews. They talked to boys and girls and teachers and the priest and the parish council, and they found that if you actually define the issue as a question of respect, you could get buy-in. So they did a project on respect. The school culture dramatically changed in the course of the year. And interestingly, and I hadn't known whether this was possible outside the movement, the girl who was the leader, a girl named Rachel, who began the year failing all of her classes, and her mother had died of a drug overdose. The process of organizing that project and speaking to public groups across the cities and working with kids at every age, it changed her life. It changed her life. She developed a sense of what she could do in the world. So I would say the first principle of citizen professional is learning the skills of working effectively in communities with a different kind of politics, which is not protest politics. And in the text of the speech, I give a lot of resources that I don't think young people hear much today, but like Bayard Rustin, From Protest to Politics, a great organizer of the civil rights movement. It was a real inspiration to me as a college student. Or Ella Baker, or the janitor at Duke, Oliver Harvey, who was a brilliant organizer and was organizing the maids and janitors. I think there's a history missing from young people's education about the legacy of that everyday organizing in politics. Charles Payne, in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, talks about the organizing tradition in the movement, which is invisible. What's visible is the mobilizing tradition of great marches and sit-ins and protests and speeches, but the actual organizing on the ground is invisible. So the first principle of citizen professional is to learn organizing approaches. Secondly, and I just want to go through this quickly, I think we need a different way of assessing. If you look at the assessment ways to talk even about civic engagement, they focus on cognitive knowledge, they focus on local knowledge and global knowledge. They don't focus on how students can learn to feel like agents of change. So the heart and the hand of assessment is missing. And a real challenge and opportunity in undergraduate education rethinking is to develop ways to assess. So what do you know as a citizen? How do you make change? How do you build relationships with people you may not like and agree with? Those are really critical questions. And thirdly, I want to conclude with the idea of narrative, public narrative. Has anyone heard of the concept of public narrative? Few. So this is relevant to every student here and everyone here. So it was developed by a community organizer who left Harvard as an undergraduate. He left after his freshman year, Marshall Gans. Spent 30 years organizing. He went to work in the civil rights movement, and then he was a community organizer, and he worked with the United Farm Workers. He concluded this from all his years, 30 years. He went back to Harvard and finally got his degree and has developed this concept. That in change, you need the head. You need to think in sober, strategic ways. You need to figure out what you're doing. But the motivation of change is the heart. What you care about, what you're passionate about. And he had observed again and again that in motivating people to take action, to get outside their private worlds, stories were extremely powerful. Both stories you hear, but also stories about yourself that you learn to tell to other people. So the concept of public narrative we used in the Obama campaign in 2008, and as I said, thousands of people learned how to do it. It said everyone has a story. You all have public narratives, whether you think that life happened to you or not. So the public narrative goes like this. You think about 2 or 3 key events or experiences in your life that had a big impact, but you don't think simply about what happened to you. You think about what you decided to do because of those experiences. So it focuses you on how you had some power even if you feel like it just happened to you. And everybody has that. Everybody has power even if they don't recognize it. And you make decisions about your life that are really consequential. So the public narrative is a very powerful way of having people focus on their own agency. Secondly, it's a story of us. It's a story of how we are here together. So it's also a complex story. It's a story of warts and struggles and blemishes. And one thing I learned in the movement is that the world is not divided between the righteous and the damned. Everybody is complicated as hell. Every story is complicated as hell. There's no story that's pure, and there's no story which is totally evil. So stories are complicated, and you need to be honest and real about stories, but you also need to know stories, and the story of us is the story of where we are today, and the story of now is why this matters. So I would say, think about this as a resource for curriculum change and retrieval at the University of Illinois. How can students and others be involved in discovering the story? Well, first of all, your own stories. Every one of you has a story. Every one of you has a story. And learning how to tell it, think about it. First of all, it's never static. I mean, I've been working on this since the Obama campaign. I keep thinking of new ways to tell my public narrative. Keep thinking of which were the really central questions, experiences I had in my life. But you begin with who you are, and you learn how to share that and talk about it. It's not just private. You learn how to be public. So some things you're not going to share. This is not tell-all. This is not therapeutic. You're not trying to have people, do an encounter group. You're actually learning how to engage people and tell your story in a way that's powerful. If you tell your story in a powerful way, it's a power resource. But then you also think about how we can learn the collective story. And it can be a story of a department, a field, a discipline, but it also can be a story of a university. And there are a huge number of stories in and around the University of Illinois that need to be recovered and interacted with and thought about and discussed and debated and reflected on. And that is a foundation for making constructive change. And I would finally conclude by saying, if higher education engages in this process of learning the democracy roots and stories that we've largely forgotten, we also are going to help revive the American democratic story. America is not a static place. America is a story of democratic possibility. We've got to get beyond the notion that our story is finished. We have to recognize that our story is beginning. And we all can help to make it. And we all need to learn how to tell the story together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Well, I think we have time for a few questions.
Sure.
And let's have a student ask the first question.
So what do y'all think about this public narrative idea? What do you think? You? No, the guy in front of you. You were kind of nodding.
No, I mean, I think it's definitely...
What's your name?
Akil.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely important to, because I've worked with a lot of youth, like high school students, and that's the biggest thing is really telling them stories that they can connect with on a personal level. And there's this atmosphere of, especially in academia, of this like heady knowledge and not being able to relate to people, but I think it is more about like heart change.
Yeah. So you like that public narrative? Somebody else? I like it. What do you think? And why don't you talk a little bit about your own experiences with the university?
Oh,
Your
just
mother's work,
as
Sally?
a Minnesotan through and through, right? What was wonderful being a graduate student at the University of Minnesota and working with you and, of course, my mom and other faculty members was that the issue of civic engagement was a faculty and student discussion and community discussion. It wasn't an isolated discussion. Everyone had it on their lips. And so because of that advantage, it was easy to begin to have even further, more nuanced conversations about what it meant for us. Particularly as Minnesotans, I think that one of the things that we had as an advantage as being Minnesotans was this idea of that we could look at democratic polity in ways that were unusual and that were more embracing for others. I think one of the struggles that we're dealing with in Illinois is to talk about galvanizing the polity in that same way, given all of the different kind of struggles we're dealing with at the state governance level. We've got a messaging issue. We've got to get there to talk to folks. And I wish we could bring some of those lessons more powerfully to this institution so that we could have a better and effective conversation. We're really in trouble.
Well, just on that point, so I want to tell a story that's in my book called Everyday Politics, so it's not a private story. So we did a lot of discussions as part of the University of Minnesota's Civic Engagement Task Force with African American clergy, with teachers, with business people, with state legislators. And they were very rich and fruitful. But one of the most telling comments when we met with legislators was from Steve Kelly, who at that point was head of the Higher Education Committee in the State Senate and a Democrat and seen as the champion of the University of Minnesota's funding. But when we had this conversation, well, the Republican minority leader, Peggy Leppick, said, as far as I'm concerned, you're arrogant as hell. So she was pretty cut and dry.
She said about you or about the university?
University.
Yeah.
She didn't know me from Adam. I just was leaving, asking questions. No, but about the university. But Steve Kelly said, when I hear the university talking about public engagement, renewed public engagement, I think you mean public relations. He said, I don't have anything against public relations. It's a messaging issue. We need to message. But he said, that's not the deepest problem. He said, the deepest problem of the University of Minnesota is that you've lost public relationships.
Yes.
All across the state. You've seen a tremendous loss of public relationships. And until you rebuild those public relationships through working differently with communities across the state, you're not going to solve the political problem you have with the state legislature, which I think is really telling. Remember that?
Yes.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Well, we may strive for democracy, but more than in a democratic tradition, the United States also has a strong economic and capitalist tradition. and a long history of very severe struggles for resources between labor and capital, between slave owners and slaves, and so forth. And it seems to me that one of the biggest threats to the kind of public engagement that you're talking about is if you have parts of society feeling that this public engagement is going to in some way feed into a struggle for resources.
Yeah.
So there's a mistrust of public engagement
Well,
among interest groups, shall we say.
Sure, look, as Frederick Douglass said, change never happens without a struggle.
Yeah.
I do think, I didn't tell the story, I don't have time to tell the story, but I had a great conversation with Martin Luther King about populism once. He said he identified more with populism than with any other tradition. So populism is the political tradition of the cooperatives, the farmers, the 1930s, and the movement, which is about popular power. And it's different than left or right. It's actually about people developing power. So I would say, in its democratic terms, it dealt with concentrations of power, but it was especially about building people's power. So it was a constructive project, which is very much, by the way, like the Scandinavian folk schools. They focused on the elites. They didn't want to have an elite-dominated educational system. The landowners and the barons, I mean, it's a very poor country, all across Scandinavia. But they mainly focused on building the democratic capacities of communities to take that on, to deal with it. So I would say that that's the great land-grant tradition and public university tradition, building power. So there's a struggle dimension, but there's also a capacity building dimension.
It seems to me that our conservative brothers and sisters have been very successful at framing higher education as an individual good. And when it becomes an individual good, the more it becomes an individual good, the less it becomes a public good. And the less it becomes a public good, the less we should invest in it, the less we should explore the very ideas that you're talking about today, the less we get connected with our land grant mission and the very notion that gave birth to this institution. And I wonder if you have reflections on that and ways to kind of
Well, I think
combat.
I think people on the conservative side have created part of the problem, but also the progressive side is not innocent. So, I mean, an example. Out of land grants in public universities, there was an enormous people's movement from 1938 to 1941, organized by Cooperative Extension, the Extension System, and USDA, around the future of rural America, from soil conservation to democracy. I mean, they had 60,000 moderators, and 3 million people participated, and 150 philosophy schools to help professionals think about their work in bigger ways. It's in a new book, Jess Gilbert's book called Planning Democracy. It's a really important book. And it had results. It really was the reason for a contour farming system that was extraordinary. And soil conservation scientists were taught to work in respectful collaboration with communities, not go in and try to fix the problem. So when Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, became Vice President, and so was a weaker secretary, he was a great champion of kind of people's democratic politics. It was ended with 3 forces coming after called the study group. That was also called the democracy movement in land-grant colleges. So the right-wing conservatives in Congress said it was a communist plot. The big farmers and the Farm Bureau said, no, they're talking too much about family farms, that we're not especially happy with family farms. And progressive academics said, what the hell do the people know about any of this stuff? We're the experts, we have the answers, we don't want them to be involved. So it's not, there are many forces against the democratic possibilities of land grants. That's what I would say in public universities. Okay, last question. Last question.
Oh, a lot of pressure. I guess my question is, you're talking a lot about going into high schools and really trying to campaign for change and stuff like that. And My question is, how, I'm an early childhood education major, so how do we empower like the need or want for change for kids who are younger, so that when they're coming into college, they're not like, oh, I can advocate for myself, like I had no idea. And I guess, how do we get kids more interested in politics and have them find their way into
Sure.
it at an earlier age? I
Well,
guess is my
you'd be
question.
surprised how much there's an appetite among very young kids for feeling powerful, feeling agents of change. In fact, one of the strands of our intellectual movement called civic studies is called civic science. And one of the major figures there was Esther Thielen, a great child development scientist who brought dynamic systems theory into the field. And her whole shtick was kids from the very time they're born want power. They want power from the very moment they're born. And they want to be co-creators. They don't want to simply have things happen to them. They want to interact with their environment. And that they develop ideas, very Dewey, and she loved Dewey and James. They develop ideas as strategies for action, not simply abstractions. But if you look at the public, we have a public achievement, so it's public achievement. Let me tell you a couple of YouTube videos. One is called We the Young People, public achievement. And if you look at that video, it's short, 15 minutes. We have several different stories of kids, the youngest of which is kindergarten. How they organized to get swing sets on their playgrounds because the older kids were hogging all the swing sets.
No.
Say the name again, please.
So it's We the Young People, public achievement. And the other one, and you'd be interested, and all of you education students would be interested. So y'all probably know special education. So it's not very successful. Stigmatizes kids. It's like the ultimate in the testocracy. Marginalizes kids, names them as failures, tries to fix them. So it's like technocracy writ large. It's like the culmination of all these trends. So we're working with the education faculty at Augsburg College and the special education, all the students at Augsburg are learning how to be coaches in public achievement as a way to be a different kind of teacher. And what we've seen from the very beginning is that if you think about young people, kids who are stigmatized and locked away in level 3 EBD as full of potential talent to make a difference and to be leaders and public change agents, it just changes the whole equation. So we have a video a student of mine at Humphrey, Jen Nelson did, of Fridley Middle School, where a level 3 EBD, that means that they were locked away. The teachers really bought into this idea of a different approach to education. And the coaches from the Augsburg and the faculty, and with the great help of Dennis Donovan, who's our great coach, used to be the principal of the St. Bernard School. These kids became community leaders. And the testimonies and the stories that they tell, and the coaches tell, and the teachers tell about how they rethought education are really very powerful. So the title of that video is Public Achievement in Fridley, Transforming Special Education. And that would give you a sense of what's possible. Okay.
Good, thank you. So if you want a little more Boyte this week, Dr. Boyte has a colloquium in the College of Education at noon tomorrow, 22 Education Building, right? And we have a light reception outside if you want to continue the conversation. Join me in thanking Harry Boyte.